You can start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Sustainable Change Alliance conversation about innovative public-private partnerships to address homelessness. My name is Robert Skinner. I'm the CEO of the Towbes Group and have been active in the cities and counties philanthropy for a number of years, formerly serving as a board of trustee member for the Santa Barbara Foundation. I'm really excited about today's goal. As a member of the board for the Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation, this to me is a great example of what people with common interests about making the communities better can accomplish. And we've brought today a really great speaker who I will introduce in 1 second. For those of you who don't know, the Sustainable Change Alliance is an impact-oriented, member-based, not-for-profit educational group. We're focused on impact investing, which we define as bringing financial and other resources to double and triple bottom line organizations that are trying to address big social, environmental, or health-related issues, and trying to do that in a sustainable manner. Some of those organizations are for profit, some are not for profit, and some come from the independent sector. I'd like to acknowledge the hard work and dedicated SCA board members who are attending this meeting. Gratitude for all of our members on this call. And finally, we could not do this without our sponsorships. Our sponsors, who are the founding sponsors: Argyle Capital Partners, Impact Family Office, Maps.com, Solgenex, and UBS. The platinum sponsors, who are Nixon Peabody Law Firm, and silver sponsorships from the Brashears Insurance. If you're not yet a member of the Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation, we encourage you or your organization to join us on this journey. Visit sustainablechangealliance.org, where you can sign up as a member. After the event, members will be encouraged to join us via a separate login for an after-hours conversation. With all that, let's get started. The meeting, as has already been said, is being recorded. Everyone is on mute, but if you are interested in asking a question, please virtually raise your hand and we'll find a way to get your questions asked and hopefully answered. There's also a chat room for taking certain questions from guests. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Elizabeth Funk. She started her career in technology, first at Microsoft, and then one of the earliest employees at Yahoo. She believes passionately about the power of the entrepreneurial spirit, and she's fallen in love with the idea of microfinance, which allows the world's poorest to start their own businesses and build their own way out of poverty. As with all of this, in 2004, she started her journey in impact investing, really before impact investing was such a thing. Yet looking at the microfinance industry, it was apparent to her that so much more good work could be done if the organizations were for profit. So on a hunch, she started the Dignity Fund, one of the first for-profit investment funds in microfinance. Since that time, she has been a leader in evangelizing the impact investment movement. Today, partially as a result of her efforts, the vast majority of money in the microfinance industry is for profit. Since that time, she's been involved in a number of impact investment funds and projects, both as a general partner and as a limited partner. She is currently the senior general partner of Dev Equity, an impact investment fund focused in Latin America, which invests about half of its portfolio in low-income housing, in addition to urban revitalization and sustainable agriculture. When the pandemic happened, she turned her sights closer to home and the homelessness crisis right here in California. Working with a group of fellow members of the YPO organization, she formed Dignity Moves, which we will hear about today. Elizabeth, Welcome.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, maybe you could share a little bit more of your passion for impact investing and how that's really framed your views about how to solve problems, societal problems.
Yeah, so my microfinance journey, and that's why I mentioned that in the introduction, is that it kind of has framed my thinking all along, which is that the microfinance industry, the vast majority of the organizations were 2,000 borrowers or fewer. There was no economies of scale. They were all little mom and pops, and they were struggling to raise philanthropy. And when you look at the model of microfinance, it can be done profitably. And so it was kind of a head scratcher of like, why are we not doing this on a for-profit basis? And there was this philosophical objection, which was that it was unethical to make money while doing good. And that was generated largely from Muhammad Yunus, who was the founder of the microfinance movement. And I just took exception to that, because when you could get economies of scale, you could actually charge a lower interest rate to borrowers. And of course, you could help a lot more people. And so what was really interesting to me was to sort of turn that thinking on its head and say, we don't need to be thinking about our models of make as much money as we can and then give it away. But even in philanthropy and philanthropic type initiatives like microfinance, you can actually do better good if you're running it as a for-profit model, and if you're expecting that kind of discipline and that kind of a growth mindset. And it turned out to be right in microfinance, and so I've kind of lived that ever since, and in all of the different investments and projects that I've undertaken.
When you bring that mentality to the problem, you really are talking about sustainability, because the models that you're building are inherently sustainable because they aren't reliant on external funding that is not tied to the activities that you're creating. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's kind of an obvious one with finance, since finance has always been tied to sort of that return of capital. And so when you take microfinance and you start building it into these businesses that then can thrive on their own, recycle that capital so you can do it again and again, it becomes a very sustainable model. How do you scale that into what we're going to talk about today, the housing and homelessness crisis?
Yeah, so I think that I believe that anything that that even if it's got a philanthropic mission, if you can challenge yourself to find a sustainable business model, you can do so much more and so much better. And so I've embarked on this housing effort first because I care about it philanthropically, and with the belief that there will be ways to make this sustainable. And quite frankly, we're on that journey. We don't know exactly what those models will be. We're experimenting with some of those models. But I believe that, especially when a new initiative is getting started, it often starts with philanthropic support while it gets more robust and becomes more structured, at which point for-profit investment dollars are more ripe to come in. So it's likely to be a hybrid in the early days, but I think it takes all sorts of capital. But I do believe that ultimately, especially if we're going to solve a problem that is as massive as our housing crisis, it's got to be done in a sustainable way.
So unlike microfinance, where each bite seems manageable, you're talking about a relatively small investment in a given business. You've touched on how big this homelessness and housing problem is. And one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is that maybe we need to change our focus. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. How might you suggest we get started in looking at impact investing to solve homelessness without trying to just solve for more homes?
Well, I think that, the most important lesson that I've learned as I've been on this journey is that we need to rethink our definition of housing. HUD has a definition of housing, which is that everybody has their own kitchen, their own bathroom, their own living room, their own space, and that's really expensive. And so one of the things that we've been starting to explore is challenging that, which is, can't we do housing in a much less expensive format, which becomes a whole lot less daunting, a financial venture, right? In California, it costs $700,000 per unit to build a studio apartment that's an supposedly affordable or supportive housing unit, right? Why does it have to be that format? And so what we started doing was thinking about, well, what would happen if we used manufactured units? What would happen if we took out bathrooms and kitchens and made those shared? What could we do to get the cost of this down to a place that can be covered by philanthropy and government initially, but ultimately by even really low, low rents? And depending on the quality of construction, we can do these for anywhere between $20,000 a unit and $100,000 a unit, but vastly different than the 700,000. And you start to get into a realm where, low rents, rents that these people can afford, could really pay for these units.
So that really requires a change in how we define societally, how we define and view what housing and homelessness is and isn't. Do you have any sense of how we get people to understand that what worked, as you mentioned before, in college is really a path forward today?
Well, I do look back on my college days as my favorite, even though I had to walk down the hall to go to the bathroom, and we had to have our meals in the community lunchroom. That was because it was a sense of community. And I think it's almost a little patronizing for us as wealthy who define housing as our mansions or our homes where we can close our door and have our own private, chef's kitchen and so forth. That privacy is not necessarily as highly valued by folks who the only thing they have is their community, right? And I think we're finding that even when we're putting people in hotel rooms, they're not loving that because it's taking them away from the one thing they have, which is their community. And I think we've taken our preconception of the definition of housing and we're imposing it down. And I think that we need to relax those assumptions and think maybe there's a portion of the population that would prefer to live together, to live in communal housing. And it is certainly ridiculously less expensive when you're not plumbing everybody's unit for kitchens and bathrooms and refrigerators and showers.
Culturally, I think I know that Carl Palmer has suggested that that our culture's views are too narrow when it comes to what is appropriate housing and how we might look to other examples. And he shared with us an example of some learning that from the Grand Teton National Park, where they were struggling to engage the Latinx community. And they really weren't clear on why the Latinx community was not using the park. And so they actually did something quite bold. They asked that community why don't you come to the park? And the answer they got, I think, surprised some people. And I think it's illustrative for this conversation. What Carl tells me is they learned that the community didn't engage with the parks because there weren't big enough areas for their families to participate. They didn't have large enough area where a single picnic table was not sufficient, because they were bringing a larger group and they wanted a space where that whole family unit could engage. And from that, I assume that that the leadership for the national park really reevaluated how they were applying resources and getting away from the single is best. And I think that you're really touching on that. You and I talked a little bit about the idea that you can divide this up into thirds. You got to get people used to the idea that we're walking up a ladder towards self-sufficiency, and that at the bottom rung, maybe you might think of it as a personal safety level where sleeping in a safe place is the first step, getting place where it's safe, but that isn't necessarily excluding the ability to transition. So could you tell us a little bit about your thinking on how you break that path as we step up the ladder towards permanent housing?
Yeah, sure. And it's kind of, been illuminated by our first partnership that we've worked with Life Moves, which is a leading services organization for homelessness in Silicon Valley. And I've learned a lot from them. And they find that when they bring people in off of the streets and get them stabilized in interim housing, that about a third of them, they are able to help exit homelessness by reuniting with family. And that's a path that we don't think about, but they can go move in with an aunt or a cousin that they've been maybe embarrassed to connect with, and have that be their starting point into stable self-sufficiency. Another third of them are able to relocate out of the more expensive jurisdictions and relocate to smaller towns or more rural areas that they wouldn't have thought of or been able to do on their own, certainly without internet and resources when they're living on the streets. And they can successfully exit homelessness, in another path, right? And so there are only about a third of them that are then left that need to, be integrated into the community right here. And that requires vouchers and help in getting self-sufficient. But as a community, if we think about the cost savings of getting folks in off of the streets and out of our systems and our medical systems and our criminal justice systems and transferring them into permanent housing, it's not a one-for-one transfer, right? And so in terms of the, quite frankly, the cost savings to society, investing in that interim step, it is really valuable. And so there are lots of exits out of homelessness. Each of those are a first step. Obviously, you don't want to live with your aunt forever, but it's a place to be stabilized. And then there are lots of journeys that happen from there.
It's interesting because if you look at the very high cost of building a permanent unit, particularly in California, jurisdictions like California, it's very, very high. And if you break it down as you just described, you're really talking about only investing about a third of that to solve potentially 3 times the number of problems, because you're able to recycle that access unit, the first level, many times. And in your example, if really 2/3 of the people migrate away from it, it leaves those units available for the next person who's in need of transition. So how do you get started? How do you focus on changing that definition jurisdictionally from an investment standpoint, socially in terms of an engagement standpoint? How do we start?
Well, I feel like, changing the legal definition of housing, which is important because you can charge rents for something that is legally housing. You can also, apply vouchers and so forth. That's an important goal. But the interim step is to create this concept that we're calling interim housing, where people can come in off of the streets. Interim housing is essentially a euphemism for shelter. We don't use the word shelter because shelter has become such an ugly word, and it's a specific concept in people's minds, which is kind of a warehouse where people are in bunk beds and communal living. And so what we've designed is units where everybody has their own room, either as a family or as individuals, with your own room with a door that locks, very akin to a college dorm room style space. And that would be an interim step where people would not pay rent. They would be supported by the great social services organizations in the community. But they would start there, and then those services agencies help them to migrate into the next place. And so the idea is to do this as interim housing in the short term, and prove the concept and get people comfortable with the fact that these communities work and that some people may want to stay there forever. And then, of course, the larger vision is that we start to build these as places where people do pay rent and they are sustainable and they are places that people can call home.
And in terms of transitioning folks, are you partnering with agencies who are providing the other kinds of services that are needed to get people to transition from a situation that is probably, for everyone involved, much less desirable into one where the stability and the opportunities are available to transition into other forms of housing?
So absolutely. So the role that we're playing is sort of the catalyst to pull all of this together. So we help try to find the land, help try to find the funding, whether it be philanthropy or public funds or impact investment money. We find the manufacturer of these units. We we've got an architect involved. Gensler is doing this pro bono for us. So we're pulling all these pieces together, but then taking the site and operating it and really doing the magic is the purview of the great services agencies that know how to do that. So in Mountain View, our project is a Life Moves project. They are building 100 units, 88 individuals and 12 families. We've got a project in San Francisco that will be run by a great services agency there. So in every case, it'll be the services agencies that will that will step in and really run the security, bring the meals, the mental health care, the employment specialists, the jobs, the housing specialists, and really, do all that wraparound services to help those folks transition, whether it be reuniting with families or wherever they're gonna exit.
This is probably a good time. First, let me make sure I see that the chat, there's a few raised hands. Let me see, let me just make sure that we're not missing any. One question that came up is the kinds of limitations that are placed on residents in these communities. Are there, how do you address issues of addiction? What about for those people who have pets? Those kinds of things. How are you managing those kinds of issues?
Well, first of all, that falls to the services agency who will operate the sites, and so it'll be based on their policies. But one of the beautiful things about everyone having their own room is that we are finding you can bring your pet, which is important, right? And to be able to have a door that locks where your pet can stay safe, your things can stay safe. Those are two of the big barriers for people going into public shelters, is that they aren't allowed to bring their animals, and they usually have a lot of fear about leaving their belongings. So having a door that locks that's private does allow you to bring your pets and your things. But in terms of addiction, that's going to vary based on the service provider and the program. So we could have a site that's built specifically for people who are grappling with addiction and have it be managed by an addiction care specialist organization. We can have sites that are specific for battered women. It can be dependent. Really, we're just creating sort of the space where the magic can happen.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Obviously, you're addressing the safety issues because of these lockable, private places where people can sleep. But as maybe we talk a little bit about Mountain View, how did you overcome the broader societal concerns that might exist, where people are saying, gosh, I'm not sure I really want this new kind of community in my backyard?
Yep. Well, there's always the NIMBYs. But it's interesting, as we've watched, because of the pandemic, that voice has really muted, and for a couple of reasons. One, quite frankly, is that because the homeless are now allowed to have tents. And so the homelessness problem is becoming really visible in our communities, literally visible, blue and red and green tents. And so all of a sudden, people are starting to warm up to the idea that maybe having a community where it's behind a fence and it's nice looking and people are showered and there's security and there's mental health care is actually a lot better than the alternative that they're faced with, which is people being in the tents on their sidewalks. And so we found, ironically, because of the tents, we're starting to have a lot less resistance to doing these sites. But the other thing about these sites is that they are by definition temporary. So these units are manufactured units that get put on the ground and can be moved. And so we will use land, for instance, that we might borrow for a few years. Maybe a developer's got a project that's tied up in entitlements, or the government's got land that they're not willing to sell or permanently part with. So we can put it someplace for a few years and then commit that we'll be leaving and moving these around. And I think that that's helped with reducing the resistance as well. But I really feel like, especially because of the pandemic, people are starting to be aware that homelessness is a health crisis and it affects them. And there seems to be a lot less resistance to addressing it in logical ways that are attractive in the community and that provide safety and security and, quite frankly, showers and medical care.
So one thing you touched on that I think is worth exploring a little more is site acquisition, because one of the big impediments in a big, huge multifamily apartment project is you got to acquire the land, and then you got to spend a long time getting it entitled. And then there are all of the risks associated with the cost of construction and so on and so forth. And before you are ready to actually house anyone, a lot of time has passed. You mentioned that because of the nature of the actual units themselves, you can be up and running quickly because you're not a permanent fixture. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that might work?
Yeah, well, the big benefit that the state government has done for us is they've issued emergency shelter building codes. So rather than all of the really enormous codes that are, ambitious and amiable, that are at the state level and at city levels for permanent housing, these are very, very simple building codes, and the local jurisdiction has to declare a shelter crisis in order to employ them. But they're very, very basic, which is that you have to have 70 square feet per person. You have to have 2 means of egress, a fire rated wall, and really that simple and very little else. And so you can do that very quickly. You don't need foundations. You don't need to do the utilities underground. We can, for temporary sites, we can do a trailer that's got showers and bathrooms in it that can be serviced by driving it off site. And so quite frankly, in these units that we've selected, they're built on site. So you get these panels that then can be assembled by volunteers in a few days. So it really, the time frame is beautifully condensed.
So in a way, it's a little like Legos, or maybe more apt. It's building back in the when people were going to conferences, these conference cities get built in 2 or 3 days. You have this huge conference, and then they get taken down and they go to the next location where they put them all up. It's a little bit like that.
Yep, it sure is. Or kind of like IKEA, but a big piece of IKEA furniture. It's big enough for somebody to sleep in.
And because you can take it back down and reuse it, it's inherently sustainable.
Right. Correct.
So,
and they can be reused. They've got a lifespan of at least 10 years. And of course, let me also say, there's a whole spectrum of different quality of products that we've evaluated. And it really depends on how long the site will be there. So for instance, our site in Mountain View, we expect will be there indefinitely because the Life Moves was able to buy that land. And so in that case, we used really high-end manufacturers who, build houses, for multi-million-dollar homes, and really high-end building materials that take longer to produce and are more expensive, but have a lifespan of 30 years. Whereas if there's a site that we only expect will be there for 2 to 5 years, we'll do something more IKEA quality, and there's everything in between.
And in terms of the overall campus construction, I want to make sure that everybody really has a good sense of this, because you're not building a traditional home where it's self-contained. You have efficiencies where several of the buildings are plumbed for showers and things of that personal hygiene needs, and maybe a centralized kitchen area. You're not really necessarily building in all of the infrastructure that a traditional home unit or apartment unit would have. Is that right?
That's correct. The individual sleeping units are connected to power, and that's it. They have heating and cooling in them, and they have, power plugs and lights, but it's just connecting those boxes to power. And then you'll have either a bathroom building that's plumbed, or if it's going to be a temporary site and we don't want to invest in that plumbing, it'll be a trailer that we can pull up and service. And then it'll have a communal bathroom, communal kitchen, communal laundry area. And then most importantly, it'll have communal meeting areas where, there can be trainings that are hosted, or, social gatherings and case manager offices and all those kinds of things. So that's all going to be outside of your little living quarters. The individual living quarters is just kind of like a college dorm room where all you have is a desk and a bed and a window.
And are those can be clustered so that for efficiency purposes, or are they all individually?
That's a great question. So what we do is we take a building that's the dimensions of a shipping container and divide it into 4 individual units, or you could divide it in half to have larger units for families. But the fire departments require that you have 6 feet of space between buildings. And so we want the building to have as many units as possible. So we'll do a building of 4. With 1 hour fire rated walls, which is plenty, especially because, it doesn't take an hour to get out of something that's, that's 80 square feet. And then 6 feet between those buildings. So you've probably seen, and I know that in Isla Vista, there's been a project that's with Pallet, where every unit is its own building. And we just don't find that format to be very space efficient.
And I assume because there is some flexibility in how these little Lego boxes are utilized, you have less cost on site preparation because you don't really have to make earth moving a big, huge aspect of the project. In fact, maybe with some undulations, you create a really wonderful living environment for people who are walking and living in that area.
We can use a parking lot. And I think that's kind of the vision, is ultimately, faith-based organizations that have oversized parking lots that they feel like that, they're underutilized, right? We could use those. We can, as long as it's relatively graded, we don't need to do any site development, other than I do think that we need to do fences around it and some nice landscaping and make it feel like it's a place that the community is thrilled to have there. But we were careful about selecting manufacturers that we think are really attractive looking and that the community will be pleased to have. And then I think it's also a great way for philanthropy and organizations to get involved, to come in with the beautification effort and help with the landscaping and those kinds of things to make it attractive.
Now, I know that in some of your projects, or at least the concepts that are under consideration, you're really looking at having traditional foundation type buildings. How do you differentiate, or what tools do you use to identify which kind of structure strategy you would use?
Well, it depends on how long the site's going to be there. So with the Home Key program, which you're probably familiar with, the state had a project which was designed to buy the hotels that we had been using during shelter in place, but nothing in the documents said that it had to be hotels. They just assumed that it would be hotels because it had to be spent by the end of the year. It was CARES Act money. And so Life Moves applied for that and was able to use that money to purchase land. So because they own the land and it will be there indefinitely, it is worth using higher quality materials and doing foundations and underground utilities and so forth. Even with that, this modular type of construction, we are at under $120,000 per door, which is just incredible given California's building costs. But then that would be there forever. And so if we were talking about this concept of these kinds of mobile houses ultimately being really housing where people would stay, then we would do that model. On the other hand, if we've got a site that's only available for 2 years, so for instance, the site we're doing in San Francisco is available for 2 years. So we'll use much more portable units and we won't do foundations. And they literally can be disassembled and packed and stored or transported.
And on those units or the locations where you're using truly temporary, are they being donated for this while another use is being processed for entitlements? Or are you paying rent for those? How does a landowner get engaged in this, and what are the benefits for doing that?
Well, so all of the answers, right? So landowners who've got land that is sitting available, I believe that they would want to be a part of this and would want to let us borrow the land. I think that there would be not only goodwill in the community. I would think that the governments would want to do them favors in terms of entitlements and all the rest for being good Samaritans, quite frankly. And so there's no reason for us not to sit on that land while it's sitting vacant. We're also talking to, the state has a database of excess land that they have declared that they want to make available to housing developers. And there are developers who are looking through that database and stepping up and saying that they'll, work on a project on a site. But you and I both know that's going to take 5 to 7 years for those projects to come to fruition. And so the state has told us, go pick the sites that you want in this database and go set up there in the meantime, right? As long as we commit that we'll be gone when the developer is ready to break ground, we should be doing this with anybody who's got vacant land. And again, faith-based organizations is another place where there's a lot of land that's available that they may not be at liberty to sell it. It may be an obligation to keep the land, but they may not want to break ground and build a permanent building. That seems like a perfect place for us to be there in the meantime.
I would agree. And in fact, going back to something that we started with is the power and importance of impact investing. That by definition is impact investing, because you're using an opportunity for the betterment of the community as a whole in a way that is not taxing. And so it's inherently sustainable, even if it's only temporary. And so I really applaud that thinking. It's a marked difference in the way land is typically utilized. It's all about ownership and permanence, whereas this is really about taking advantage of the opportunity. It's a solutions-based approach. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you identify opportunities, and maybe you could share how the Santa Barbara community or the Tri-Counties might be able to help you identify sites that make sense.
Well, at this point, it's really kind of networking around with our like-minded impact investor communities and philanthropic communities and asking, who's got sites that they think might be available. And, I do believe that governments, and we are talking, government to government and city council districts and, so forth around LA and San Francisco and other smaller cities. But I think the relationship that seems to be making a lot of sense right now as we go to, for instance, we're having great conversations in Los Angeles, is if we at the private sector can bring the funding to build the site, whether that be philanthropy or whether that be as impact investors, then the government should be responsible for the ongoing services. And that seems to be a partnership split that makes a lot of sense. Certainly philanthropy or private investors feel more comfortable investing in something they can see and touch. And so being a part of building the units is tangible. And quite frankly, the price point is bite-sized for folks. And so it makes a lot of sense, I think, for the community to be involved in building the sites. And then I think it's the government's obligation to pay for those services on an ongoing basis. And they do tend to have budgets for that. And so we're going, community to community and making the offer and saying, let us help you do this. I find that governments don't tend to have the staff and the teams that build sites. They tend to sit on top of contracts. And so they need someone like us to say, we're here to pull together the architect and the general contractor and help you find the land and pull it all together. And governments tend to be really eager to do that. So we're out having those conversations right now.
And then you operate the facility for as long as the term is available, bringing in outside partners, which one of the members noted that there's a lot of government money available for service delivery, but there's not a lot of places to deliver the services. So you're really you're meshing together those two things.
And that seems like such an unacceptable answer to me, right? Which is, there's no reason there can't be places available for folks to deliver those services. We could do these things for $10,000 a door, right? And so, if governments don't have the money to spend upfront to build a site, then let's finance it. Guys, all of us on this phone will finance it, and the government can pay us back over time, lease them from us at a rate that pays back the investors. Or we can get philanthropy to put in the money upfront to buy these units. There are lots of ways to do it. And the answer of we don't have the upfront money, we just have these small, annual budgets. There's no reason we can't work around that.
Someone just, I think maybe in response to where we were heading, asked that, what are your thoughts about service-resistant individuals who are suffering from chronic homelessness, mental illness, and addiction? How does that cohort impact what you're trying to do?
Well, so the gentleman who ran the homelessness department in San Francisco and I had a really insightful conversation where he said that when he had shelter beds available, he would send his outreach team out to the encampments and say, we've got beds available. And about 10% of folks would opt to go to a shelter bed. He said that when he's got sites where people have their own room, it's north of 90% accept to come. That's really, really marked. It speaks volumes about the fact that people are willing to come in. They know they're going to have their privacy, probably able to bring their pet and whatever. And it quite frankly, to use the word, it lures them in. It's something that would be attractive enough to get them to give it a chance and to come to the site. And the real benefit to those folks is less the bed. It's about that the bed was the reason they came. And then they stay because they get the services and the support that they didn't think they were willing to receive, but they're watching everyone else benefit from it. They're interacting with the staff every day because they have to come out of their room, to go to the bathroom and to use the kitchen. And the services start to happen to them. And I think it's I think it's marvelous. And it's one of the reasons, quite frankly, philosophically, that even on our Home Key project that Life Moves did in Mountain View, where we had the budget, we could have put bathrooms in every unit. And Life Moves chose not to because they wanted people to have to come out of their unit at least a couple times a day and interact with the staff and start to be exposed to the services that they might not have thought they wanted.
And build community along the way, right?
Right.
You know, you mentioned it's about $10,000 per door. And I understand that on a unit basis, you're talking about $150,000 per unit. That is, you know, a quarter of the cost of building what we would traditionally think of as a housing unit. And so if you're really trying to drive change, where we're creating opportunities for people to have safe and secure places to live and transition to more traditional market-driven kinds of housing, you can do essentially 4 times the good with the same dollar. So why aren't we, what are the impediments to getting like-minded people to make these kinds of investments? It seems so obvious.
Well, so on the high end, when you're talking about the $150,000 units, those are the ones that I believe could be actual housing, right? And the problem is that right now our government doesn't define that as housing, and so you can't accept vouchers, and taking rent becomes tricky, and so there's not a sustainable model for that other than philanthropy and government support. And so there needs to be a change in the definition of housing, I think, at the national level and at the state level, to allow that to be considered housing, so that you can then start to have impact investors and even traditional real estate investors who are focused on the low income workforce housing model to go downstream and really start to create this as a business model. Right now, there's no business model around housing that doesn't have bathrooms and kitchens.
It's interesting because it's one of the reasons why there's so much success in mixed use housing models, because people have grown accustomed to the idea that if you live in one of these communities, walking downstairs and across the way to the little market that's there so you can get your daily needs is much better experience than doing what most of us do, which is get in the car and drive to the grocery store and load up for a week, or in my case, try to load up forever because I hate the grocery store. But you miss that intimacy and the interaction when you sort of break down the barriers of this more open communal living, which is probably why it once people get in these things, they may actually want to have that as a housing model.
Exactly. And it kind of harkens back to my impact investing in Latin America, where in Honduras we find that you've got a lot of these families that are living in slums in, quite frankly, the most dangerous city in the world outside of a war zone, San Pedro de Sula, and they stay in those slums even though there's gunshots and all the rest, because they have their community. And so what we did was we built a site which had enough room for 3,000 homes. But we built it in these clover leaves where it was a series of these cul-de-sacs. And we would go to one slum at a time and market and say, you can buy these little homes on the cul-de-sac with your friends, and they could all come together. And they sold out in hours, right? And they would all come and they'd have their little cul-de-sac where that community could stay. And it was designed around a soccer field and a school and little shops and whatever, so that the families never had to leave. And that kind of sense of community was incredibly powerful and was able to bring people out of the slums and into a safe and dignified place. And I think the parallel is really striking.
We have about 13 minutes remaining, and I'm wondering if Stephen, if you might want to open up for people who want to ask directly a question. I feel like there's an opportunity for some real dialogue. Does anyone have
that would be great, because several so we've got a little team of folks. As you mentioned, we came out of an organization called YPO, but we're now a broad coalition of business people who are working on doing this across California. But several of our folks are Santa Barbara specific, and we are working with the county in Santa Barbara to hopefully do a site or even several sites like this in the county. And so Ron Baum and his wife Morales and Matt Riley and several others, Aaron Edelheit, are all on this call, I believe, and are part of that team. If any of those would like to speak up.
Yeah, just share the fact that we're a very diverse team. We're sort of the local team. The ones Aaron and Matt and myself and a couple of others are on the local team for Dignity Moves. But also, it's a very diverse group of people. And I think that's one of the strengths of being able to come in and work with the community, because we can work with the service providers, we can work with the landowners, the developers, the governments, and the members of the team have connections in all those areas or experience directly. So it's pretty exciting to see this move forward with so much positive support from the government.
Yeah, and what I would just say is that what's really exciting is to think about that there is this land that's not being used here in our community, and that we can leverage not only the land that's being used, but possibly budget from the Santa Barbara County. And if we were to augment that with philanthropy, and this, one of the the things that I love about Santa Barbara is just how truly generous the community is. And I think there's possibly an opportunity here in Santa Barbara where we could not only leverage the land, not only leverage the county's budget, but leverage philanthropic dollars to possibly not do one site, but multiple sites, and really make a dent and get people off the streets. And that's very, very exciting to consider.
And I guess I'll just add that one thing that was mentioned numerous times, but first of all, thank you, Elizabeth, for championing this. I think that all of us in Santa Barbara that are feeling the benefit of this really appreciate your efforts to form the organization statewide, and then to also focus on Santa Barbara. So I think we all would like to say thank you. But also we want to, I think we should also highlight just briefly that this is a very targeted approach to interim housing. So this isn't, we've noticed that we do have housing shelters, and we do know that our local jurisdictions, especially on the West Coast, are focusing on permanent housing, but it's this interim step. And we've touched on it a number of times. I think it's just something important to highlight, that is where we are focused. So we're not focused on the shelters, we're not focused on the permanent housing so much, we're focused on this interim step. And that's just, we've found in California, at least, that there's a tremendous lack of that type of housing support.
And Matt, I think that's an important thing to clarify and make sure everyone understands is that the East Coast and West Coast have had very different strategies in terms of how they've addressed homelessness. On the East Coast, because of the weather, quite frankly, there's been a necessity that most of the homelessness budgets go towards shelter so that people don't literally freeze outdoors. And so there are enough shelter beds in New York City and other places for anyone who needs it. The problem is there's not enough budget left over for them to invest in permanent supportive housing or permanent low-income housing at the government level. And so they stay in the shelter system forever. And it is truly a shelter system. And in unfortunately, lots of the negative connotations of that, where they're not working with those people, it is just truly a bed. On the other hand, on the West Coast, we've had the opposite philosophy, which is, from a policy perspective, the vast majority of our homelessness dollars go into building permanent housing, particularly permanent supportive housing. And we've done that at the expense of investing in shelter. Shelter's been an afterthought. And as a result, 72% of our homeless in California are unsheltered. And that's where we're trying to come in and say, look, there's a middle ground here. We can invest in something other than these sort of shelters that are these big, warehouses, which have the stereotype of not really working with people. And by the way, in the West Coast, that's not terribly fair because a lot of the shelter service agencies do great work. But to step that up a little bit and invest truly in this interim stage for folks is fiscally responsible. I really do believe, because it gets people out of the healthcare systems and out of the jail systems. But it shouldn't be an either or, and we're not in any way saying that it isn't important to also invest in permanent housing, and certainly ending our housing crisis is going to require that we do continue to invest in permanent housing of all forms, but it shouldn't be an either or.
But you raise a really important point. This is a systems approach, because while we need permanent housing and we may need shelter, if you don't build this transitional step, there's no place to go. And that's really why it's a spectrum. It's really in order to solve this problem, we need to ensure that each rung of this ladder is helpful in the transition of the needs of the people who are on that rung. And one of the areas where, if you just build affordable housing as an example, you create a new system of haves. It's better than what was before, but there's no way for those people who are at the lowest economic level to get out of the super subsidized housing, because we don't create a systems approach to this resolution of this problem. And what you're really talking about is identifying that there really is a continuum, and we need to be having conversations about each of those steps in order to solve a much bigger societal problem.
Exactly. And, when you think about housing as sort of a ladder, and our friend Carl Palmer kind of coined this with me, but, there's nothing between tents and a full studio apartment in our system, right? And there should be something that is a dignified form of truly interim housing, where you stay for a little while and get stabilized. And then maybe there's another form, which is an upgraded version that, where you stay much longer or maybe indefinitely. Maybe there's another form, which is studio apartments that are supportive. There are all sorts of other rungs in there, and being able to help people on each rung and give them the support services they need to be able to move up is really important. And we do find that if you take someone straight from a tent and pop them into their own apartment, that's a recipe for failure. Those numbers don't tend to work. They need to have the steps along the way.
That's terrific. Are there any other questions? Chuck.
Hi, Elizabeth. I am just thrilled at what you're doing, and I'm sorry that I haven't heard about it sooner. I hope to connect with you after the meeting. But I have a specific question. You keep referring to this notion of changing regulations about what is housing. There seems to be a lot of receptive people in the legislature, people like Scott Wiener, who might be open to this. Is there current legislation moving forward?
There's not, but I have spoken to both Scott and a few other at the state Senate level, and we're having those conversations. We're giving those nudges. Thank you, and thank you for your comments. I would love to connect with you afterwards.
Are there other people who might want to ask a question? Okay. One of the comments early on, and I want to give a shout out to Nadra Ehrman, who I work with, because I think her comment was really quite thoughtful and profound. She mentioned early on that the conversation we were having made her think of something from Lisa Watson, and I'm going to read the quote because I really do think it's quite important. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I really do think that captures the essence of what you're proposing that we're doing. This is a solution that requires a whole village to participate. And one of the things that I think is unique is because you're sensitive to the land ownership constraints, you can use land that's held idly while it's transitioning to something else into something that makes a huge societal difference. And I want to make sure that it's obvious to everyone, just because a industrial site is in transition for something that is going to be an industrial site in the future doesn't mean that your team can't use that to create some interim transitional housing that is needed in that community, because the zoning issues aren't so complicated. We just need to get a transition, a temporary use permit for that kind of thing. So it could be a commercial site, it could be a home site, it could be a long-term residential site, or it could be anything else in between, as long as the land is made available and there are environmental constraints that meet the needs of the housing opportunity. And so it really is a way for us to look at unused land as an opportunity that can be accessed efficiently without creating, the long window of transition that a normal development site might take.
Makes a lot of sense.
Well, in closing, do you have any other final thoughts? We have about 2 minutes.
Taking a look at some of these questions. Well, I just want to say I'm really grateful to be here. The Santa Barbara community has been really receptive to this concept. I'm hopeful that we'll be doing a site or maybe several sites together in your community. And I think that this open-mindedness about, like you said, how to best maximize the use of the underutilized land, and with philanthropic and impact investing angle that this community has, I think we could be a real shining example of how a community could come together and bring their unsheltered in and work with them and get them on that housing ladder. I think that this community could really be a leading national example, and I would love to work with you to do that.
Terrific. Thank you very much for your time. There is the after hours, the after party that is available to SCA members. And I would encourage you to join us as we engage Elizabeth in more conversation around this area. I also understand, and Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, that this recording will be available for watching. Is that available for community members as a whole, or is that only for members?
Yeah, Rob, that'll be, well, first of all, thank you to you, and thank you to Elizabeth for a really scintillating conversation. And I have to say, this conversation has been especially good because Matt and Aaron and Ron and Marlise, who are all big participants in this group, we're here. So thank you for that. All of the SCA conversations, which have been fortnightly for the last year plus, are available on our website, which is sustainablechangealliance.org, or on our YouTube channel.
Terrific.
And I put my contact information in the chat. A few of you have pinged me and asked for it. So anybody that would like to connect and discuss further, I would welcome it.
Great.
Including at the next session.
I will see all of you at the next session.
Sounds great. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Gary.
you.
Fantastic.